Yeah, hello everybody to Global Economics, and what we have done is a short recapitulation of the general model of the introductory course, then from a more theoretical approach. And what we there have derived is in general the qualitative impact if we are changing the framework, if we are doing economic policy, though this was just this calculation larger zero of both fiscal and monetary policy. And after this, we then went into more detail explaining how this monetary policy explicitly is feeding through into the economy. So this was then a more qualitative explanation. And then we went on and said within this model, we still not talking about price adjustments. And then at first we talked about the liquidity trap, and especially and we look at this diagram here. And this is then, of course, in practice, we always need then not only direction, prices are increasing, output is increasing, but of course we have to have a general idea about the quantitative adjustment. Is it really harmful? Does it really work? Remember when I talked about the fiscal multiplier? Well, we have to know, starting an approach using this general positive adjustment of GDP. Well, is it a reasonable adjustment? Is it really helpful? If it's only an adjustment of 0.1 percentage points or something like this, well, why should I why should I do it? Because in behind, of course, we always have using these tools also transaction costs. And and here we talked about the fact that due to the elasticity, the interest rate elasticity within the money market, we can argue if it's very elastic, that then, although we still have the positive direction of monetary policy, it will almost not help in a quantitative kind of manner. And if we look back into the last 10 years, then this is a quite good explanation which we have seen between 2010 and 2020. I don't know when you have had your first banking account, maybe in 2016, 17 or something like this. Maybe you also got a letter during this time from your bank. Well, I see you have at your direct deposit 10,000 euros or something like this. If you do not invest this, I will go to charge you some slight amount. And actually, in the savings banking sector in Germany, this was then cancelled by law, but they started to increase a slight payment. Well, and the argumentation was, remember the deposit facility of the central bank, that during this time, the private banks, they decided to put very much money into the deposit facility at the European Central Bank. Well, and this was the time where the interest rate of the deposit facility was minus 0.5%. So they had to pay putting the money there. But I said, well, it was their free decision to do it. But then they argued, since we have to pay for our money, depositing it at the European Central Bank, we will charge our our customers. Um, and the thing behind it was, in this time, remember also these very huge buying programs of government of government bonds. We really, did very expensive monetary policy during this time. But still, we did not invest, especially in the stock markets or somewhere else. We still hold our money just at our banking accounts. And one explanation is that within these times we were in this very interest rate elastic money market. So in this very interest rate elastic part of the LM curve. Yeah, and then we talked also about expectations and especially about inflation expectations, and that these expectations are very, very important. And in general, if one would go further to general equilibrium models, then they are always modeled stochastically with expectation values. And of course, and this is right now our huge problem in the world, that we maybe can quite good calculate or have an idea about the expectations what the second largest economy in the world will do, China. Well, maybe they do not things what we want, but they are quite stable. We are not very surprised in what they are doing. But what is right now very, very difficult is to calculate what will the most important, the largest economy in the world do tomorrow. Well, maybe something will change if we look at the polls 2 days ago of the mayor of New York and Virginia, I think the governor or what it was. We'll see what happens there, but right now, in order to form something like the expectations here and inflation expectations, there we see how important they really are. Because after the analysis of the polls of the elections in the United States, we of course ask ourselves, how could this happen that this guy got into office a second time in a minute? And one main reason was the inflation, and especially the inflation expectations which the citizens in the United States have. What will happen to inflation if Joe Biden would, or then Kamala Harris would win would win the elections? Because we had this time of very high inflation just before the elections in the United States. Well, of course, Mr. Trump, he promised something and then he did the opposite. And right now, we still have high inflation rates in the United States. And from the market side, maybe this will also be helpful in the future. Although it's bad for the economy in the United States, maybe it's helpful to get rid of this guy. Because then a broader community of citizens would ask maybe themselves, was this a good decision? Yeah. Well, not well in real interest rates, they could actually lie everywhere, and we see this also if we take longer time series. So if we go, for example, after World War II in the 1950s, 1960s, there we also had already a period of quite negative real interest rates. So this is then, of course, always remember the Fisher equation, which is just this equation here, that we see that this view, what drives us in our economic behavior, maybe not in the short run, but in the long run, that we then really see if this is negative, that then really we start to shift our consumption planes to today. Because then we say, well, negative, giving my money for 3 years away, in real terms, I will have less than today. Then we really see this shift. Was this your question? General negative? Or for the nominal interest rate, remember there, the zero is a special number because of the alternative holding cash money. And cash money is then something like the benchmark. You cannot go below zero because I have always an alternative holding money which gives me zero interest, gives me 0% interest rate. Yeah, but for the real real interest rate, we have not such a special number. So zero is no special point for this. It is just the point where the valuation of today's versus future money is changing. So we can say the government should look which sign has the real interest rate or the real expected interest rate. Do I want my people to consume relatively more today? Then it is not the worst if the real interest rate is negative. But of course, in general, for general economic growth, if I think in the long run, then of course this means quite often long-term investments. Then this situation would be not that good if it would be negative, because for longer term investments, I need higher savings that I can finance my investments by the overall savings. So, it is no border, this zero relative to real interest rates, but it then changes just the incentives. Will I relatively more invest or will I relatively more consume? Okay. Uh, yes, of course. If we would now include that we have different currencies, this we haven't done right now. Maybe in the end of the lecture, I will come to the so-called ISLM ZZ model. Then we are including also the exchange rate. But of course, within the prices, when I say in order to consume goods of the United States, then I can consume these goods only if I, at the first step, have converted my euro into US dollars. So the exchange rate is, of course, also changing my personal price level. Yeah. So of course, within an expectation, within an inflation expectation, we find, of course, also an expectation of the exchange rate. Yeah, but we haven't modeled this right now. Maybe we have time. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. And there explicitly, then we mentioned that we have, or it is reasonable that one would have within an economy a quite serious problem if the inflation expectations become negative. And this is then in the end also the central argument why, remember, in general, for the European Monetary Union, we explicitly have the target of 2% inflation rate, which we call price stable. And this is maybe something somehow surprisingly, because, then we talk about stable prices if the prices are increasing. And this is then the argumentation for the reason for this, because if in general we have negative inflation rates, then we are shifting also to today's consumption, and that this in general would mainly decrease longer term investments, and these longer term investments are really needed for a suitable economic growth within our economy. And therefore we can say this 2 percentage points above zero, this is somehow a security system that we do not fall into deflation expectations. And of course, that such a scenario is quite relevant, is especially when we are looking at the measured by nominal GDP fourth largest economy in the world, because Japan is in such a situation for the last 30 years. And this is still a serious problem for this economy. Okay, but now, since we have started to introduce prices and price expectations, we will go further, and we will now introduce, until now we have talked about monetary policy changing the money supply. But then we have to admit, monetary policy is not done by mainly changing the money supply. Maybe this government bond program, buying program during the decade between 2010 and 2020 can be interpreted like this. But in general, we look at a change of the interest rate. And for this, one introduces, or in order to model monetary policy, one creates the concept of the reaction function of the central bank. And this means our target is the short-term interest rate. So we will have some aim. Well, I want to be that the short-term interest rate is maybe at 2.5%. This is sometimes even announced. And think of the explicit target of the ECB. We have talked about this some minutes ago, 2% inflation rate in the medium term. And I said this 2 to 3 or 2 to 4% roughly is in general a target which we find as an inflation target at almost all central banks of at least developed countries. So it would be also a good idea for your term papers that you just go to the page of your central bank within your country and try to look up if you can find maybe an explicit, or maybe where it said, well, of course we have the qualitative, and this is an aim of a target of every central bank, at least, of course, at first in democracies, is price level stability, and mostly I think you also will find, well, in general, this should be around 2 or 3%. So this you can look up. Well, and then the reaction function of the central bank is then constructed like this. Remember the Fisher equation. We know if inflation goes down, that then we want to get down with the um, real interest rate, or interest rate, price of credits implicates an increase of general output. And if the output is pushed on the other way, a second effect will be then, of course, that interest rates will rise again. So this would be the reaction. And in general, again, real interest rates defined as the difference between nominal interest rates and expectation, that we say in the very long run again, we assume there will be some natural rate of interest. So remember we had compare U star, this was the natural rate of unemployment, and Y star, here we have it, we have potential output, and there we also said, well, somehow it is maybe the long-term trend. Yeah. So these 3 star numbers will be then, so to speak, yeah, the long run equilibrium of our economy. So then this means in our reaction function, where do I want to have the real interest rate? It is positioned around the long-term natural rate of interest. And then I say, okay, I will increase the interest rate if the inflation is above my target. These are, for example, the 2% of the ECB. Y will I and B, of course, is larger than 0. So if this number or this difference is positive, so if the actual inflation rate is larger than the 2%, I will start to increase interest rates because why? Well, I will cool down the economy so that the demand is shifted to the left, because then I will have less price pressure. And remember the very, very steep increase of interest rates after Corona, when we had the inflation rates peaking at 10%. So within 6 months, we increased interest rates by 4%, which was the fastest increase of interest rates ever. Yeah, and also when the output gap is positive, so if the actual output is larger than potential output, think of in what kind of situation we are within the business cycle. We are in the increase or in the in a boom, in a peak. Yeah. And then also, what will be the aim of the central bank? Well, we want that we do not fluctuate that much, so that the economy is not overheating. So also with some intensity parameter, which again is positive, if we are above potential output, we will also increase interest rates. And this, from a qualitative point of view, is a very simple reaction function. And of course, then we have to test such kind of a reaction function by reality. The argumentation that the direction of the central bank due to the development of inflation and output will be in this direction, this is of course quite reasonable, but of course we want to see, does it match reality? Can we somehow, so to speak, really forecast with such a very, very simple rule? It's just a linear dependence. Can we forecast with such a very simple model reality? And this was a very big surprise in the 1990s or 1980s, where John B. Taylor wrote a short paper. You see here 20 pages. You can click on this and then download it. It is a very, very famous paper. It is not hard to understand. It's just explaining the rule, what I have done within 10 minutes. And then he said, well, I took A and or B and C to 0.5, and I roughly estimate that the long-term interest rate, natural rate interest rate, would be 2%. And then I can take the historical data of the United States and the announcement of interest rates in the United States of the Federal Reserve for a quite long period, 6 years. And what you see here is the federal funds rate. This is the key interest rate, main refinancing operations in the United States. It's not called main refinancing operations, but it is the same as in Europe. Key interest rate of the Fed, and the dotted line is just given output and inflation in every quarter, what comes out if the Fed would not have asked his staff of 1,000 people and discussed it in the Federal Reserve Committee, where should we set interest rates? If they would just say, well, let's take this simple rule, you just would have obtained the dotted line, which almost perfectly fits the development of the interest rate, which was set by the Federal Reserve. So, and this was actually quite astonishing because, of course, in general, we said it is a very hard task to find somehow where should I set the interest rate for the future by the central bank. Well, and therefore, one now can say in general, we somehow assumed, is it possible for us to find these three parameters reasonably, R star, B, and C, in order to describe with this very simple rule the reaction of the central bank. And this is one of the main approaches to fit the reaction of central banks when we want to model monetary policy. Then during, of course, these zero nominal interest rate period, there it doesn't really work because of this general limit there. But maybe I have time that I can do now an estimation, because it will be, I thought it would be quite interesting if after Corona we started again into a period where we can fit the reaction of the Fed and the ECB especially, just using this simple rule. Yeah, and now let's somehow put this rule into our model, using this now as the approach to model the reaction of the central bank, and not as in the ISLM model using the variable of monetary aggregate. So, oops, this was too fast. There we are. Here we are. So, and yeah, hopefully not very astonishing. Within our model is not really changing anything. So it is somehow a similar approach to model the money market, because of course we have now this system here, or this dependence of interest rates, especially on output. Now within these alpha, we just sum up all fixed numbers, and this of course we can write as R star plus B pi minus B pi star plus CY plus minus CY star. This is fixed, and this is fixed. So just summing up these three numbers is also fixed, and this we then call just a new fixed number alpha. Okay, and then of course we see, taking the derivative of interest rates with respect to output, we just obtain the other fixed number, the intensity parameter, in front of the output gap C, which is positive. And this means we obtain interest rates depending on output is a positive dependence, and this is similar to our positive dependence of the LM curve, which was also an increasing function, interest rates depending on output. So the same qualitative dependence as via the LM curve. So qualitatively, then within our model, nothing has changed. But it is another explanation of this dependence. Yeah, and then compared to the ISLM model, the overall equilibrium within our country would be then the cut of the Taylor rule and the IS curve. So this would be then I start, R star, and this is Y star. Well, within the ISLM model, we had said that we looked at nominal interest rates, but nominal interest rates are just given by the Fisher equation with relation to the real interest rates. So if we still assume that prices do not really adjust, nothing change in the mechanics within our model. So this we have done in mind. And yeah, let's now introduce the Phillips curve. I think 2 weeks ago we have talked about the Phillips curve, the dependence between inflation and unemployment. And since we can assume that we have an inverse, an inverse dependence between unemployment and output, the negative dependence, the higher the inflation, the lower the unemployment, means that we also then can assume a positive dependence. The higher inflation, the higher is the output. And this again, we want to model very simple, that we say actually inflation depends, of course, on our expected inflation plus a positive dependence on output. And here, this positive intensity in a parameter should be then called delta. So we obtain also a dependence of inflation on output via the Phillips curve, which we had introduced 2 weeks ago. Yeah, and now, since we have this Phillips curve, the dependence, the explicited assumed dependence between inflation and output, we can now feed in the Phillips curve into our reaction function. Yeah, so maybe I should copy this. Would be better if I take this one also to this slide here. Oops. This was our reaction function of the central bank, and we have the Phillips curve. Pi is equal to pi e plus delta y. That then we obtain our monetary policy rule is now not anymore depending on our parameter pi, but only depending on our not parameter, on our variable y. And I see here, for simplicity, we set just y star and pi star to 0. Otherwise, it would be just a positive number and shifts all curves a little bit upward. So then I can multiply out this bracket, and this would mean then that I end up with a new parameter in front of the output showing the dependence on interest rate. Before that, we had only the C, and now we have B plus delta plus C, but all these three numbers are positive, so this is another positive number. And yeah, somehow this is now describing the direct effect on output, which is given by C. And then I have this indirect effect on output via the reaction function and especially the Phillips curve. So we have to adjust a little bit now our model, that we're not using now the Taylor rule, but since B times delta is a positive number, so B times delta plus C is a little bit larger than C itself. So the slope of our line will become a little bit steeper. And now we are using this for the money market, and this is called then our general monetary policy rule. Well, and of course, the estimation of Taylor was done for the 1980s, and this is now almost 40 years ago. And but what is quite nice from the Atlanta Federal Reserve, they provide, and I just found it here, a quite nice tool where they provided a real-time estimation of the Taylor rule. So this is your FFR, federal funds rate. These are our interest rates. And yeah, it is a little bit more complicated than our. It is a little bit more sophisticated, but in the end, it looks more or less like the same as we did it here in the lecture. This is now written not in real interest rates, since we have here R plus pi. So this is, of course, then written in nominal interest rates, because, of course, the Fed sets nominal interest rates, not real interest rates. And here you have the dependence on, no, here you have, oh, sorry. So this is then, our part of the dependence on the natural rate. This is the dependence of the gap of inflation with respect of the target. And this is the dependence on the output gap. And what this also then assumes, and this is quite often done when you are doing econometric estimations, and maybe it is one of the most used forecast instrument, because if I ask you what is the weather tomorrow, what would be your first simple estimation method in order to forecast the weather tomorrow? Pardon? Steady states, because or it stays just the same. So the very simple forecast method is I'm looking outside and say, well, the weather is fine, so it will be fine tomorrow. And what we are doing here is also about, sorry, this is not possible, about these dependencies here. We have already talked from a theoretical point of view. And then what we also do in practice quite often is that we say, well, it is also just depending on the interest rate yesterday. And this is a so-called autocorrelation. And this is the term which we see here. So interest rates set tomorrow in time t are a function of the interest rate of yesterday of t minus 1. Well, I don't know if you have heard about this in other lectures already. This is also a very, very famous assumption in capital markets in general. This is the so-called efficient market hypothesis. Have you heard about this already? So if we assume for this, Eugene Farmer, I don't know when, I think in the 1990s, obtained the Nobel Prize for this. He has done much research in the 1970s, and he said, well, if we assume financial markets, then this would mean that in the prices of the financial markets, so in interest rates, in stock prices, and so on, we find all available information we have. And these prices all come out of equilibrium processes. And this then, if you assume this, that you have fully functioning markets, efficient markets, that then you cannot be better than the prices you are seeing. Because if you would be better, then you have further information. And within such a framework, you then can show from theoretical approach of statistics that then the expected value of the price tomorrow, if you assume that all information are incorporated in the prices today, is just the price today. So this is a very often used assumption in order to model, or in order to create a model in financial markets, is that we feed in the assumption that the expected value of some variable of price development is just equal to the price today. So this is then maybe also a motivation that we find within this modeling here, dependence on the interest rate yesterday. Okay, and then we can create our own calculation for the United States. What have we done here? Set to 2%. The inflation rate may be quite reasonable. What is this? Well, let's take the natural interest rate also to 2% to be a little bit more easy. Resource gap measure. Well, this you find if you look at the statements of the Fed, that they quite often do not directly face on the output, but that they focus on the labor market, especially on the unemployment rate. And therefore, this was generally set, but well, we have taken the output gap, so let's take then here real GDP. What CBO means, actually, I have to admit, I don't know. So, core inflation. So I don't know, in the introductory course, have I talked about core inflation? I do not remember. Well, but what I have talked about is the impact of energy prices on inflation. And there I showed you that in the last years, especially in the last 20 years, we have very high fluctuations in energy prices, and that in extreme situations, the whole inflation rate is mainly driven only by energy prices, which make only 10% of overall the overall consumption basket. Well, and then of course, if you want to make an estimation, then it would be sometimes not a good choice to take the inflation parameter, because you know this is driven by only the oil price. So I take then out all these quite volatile goods, and this is then done that I say, well, I take the inflation basket without the energy sector, and also what is also quite volatile are the agricultural goods. Because of course salad during summer times is quite often cheaper than during winter time. And all these very volatile goods I take out, and then I talk about the rest of the basket as the core inflation. And if I want to make a longer term estimation, then it is quite often a good choice not to look at the inflation itself, but only at the core inflation. And this is done here, but we in our model have talked about the inflation itself, and therefore then let's just take the inflation itself. And yeah, here's then taken the estimate, the rolling estimate over 4 quarters. So then we have the weight on the gap, 0.5, maybe quite good. Interest rate smoothing. This is 0. This should be then the parameter rho in front of here. So then they said we set the dependence on the historical interest rate to 0 and on the natural rate to be 1. Well, let's start with 0 and then let's make a second shot that we set this maybe to 0.5. Okay, so the rest we have, this would be then alternative 1. Yeah. And alternative 1 is the blue line, this one. And the actual funds rate is this one. Why is it starting only at 2010? I don't know. So then we have to compare alternative 1, which is, oh, not the blue, the orange one, and the federal funds rate is this one. Well, and yeah, you see that especially within Corona here, it doesn't really match. Of course, I said during the turmoil of Corona, we can just skip it because there's something else, not very economic behavior we have found. Then this would have forecasted an overshooting relative to the increase. But right now, and therefore maybe I should do it, it fits again quite well in the end in the last 2 years. And before Corona, it also was quite reasonable, a little bit higher. Okay, let's see if we correlate it on the historical one, 0.5. Changed, not really. Let's change the other parameter. If we focus more on output, this can be set up to 5. Let's use 5. Oops, do I have to apply it somewhere? Create your calculations. Up to 5. Well, maybe one has to play a little bit more around with the numbers. But in the end, you see, this is then what you are doing when you are doing econometrics, that you somehow want to calibrate to fit your model, changing the parameters on reality. Okay. Then let's go back to our model and Yeah. Oops. What we then can also discuss is, yeah, what in reality, where do we find these parameters A, B, C, and delta in general? And then we can say, well, if we would have a central bank which only focuses on prices, and this was especially the case more or less for the Swedish National Bank and for the Bank of England. They during some time had a very explicit inflation target, and they said, well, we do not care about anything else but only on inflation. And this then would just mean, okay, the parameter C would be 0. Because remember, C here is just the intensity parameter in front of the output gap. And if this is 0, I do not care about output anymore. And still I have the indirect effect via the Phillips curve, because then B plus delta is not 0, but the monetary policy curve will be a little bit flatter. And if we then think of what would mean a real shock on our economy, or what would mean fiscal policy, if I look at the commodity market, this would shift the this would shift the IS curve to the right, and in general, this would then mean that interest rates would respond a little less on shocks on the output side. And then fiscal policy would be a little bit more effective, because think of the crowding out effect. A positive shock on output would in general increase interest rates. An increase of interest rates would dampen investment, because investment financed via credit would be more expensive. And yeah, somehow we can say there was, or there is maybe still a general difference between the number of these parameters between the European view on the economy and the US American view on the economy. That in Europe, in the tradition, especially from Germany, from the Bundesbank, we focus a little bit more on prices than in the United States. And this we also see in the data that that inflation is a little bit more volatile in the United States, and also interest rates. And yeah, then we also can do it in the opposite way, that we do not care, so to speak, about prices and only focusing on the output. This would be then that yeah, we give more weight on this output gap. And well, this approach was somehow done a little bit within the financial crisis, because there it was more important to really stabilize this output situation. But in the aftermath, and then of course also after Corona, we do not see this kind of output targeting in reality, with the exception if we look, for example, at Turkey, where we have a special situation where also the central bank is not really independent anymore from the government, where Mr. Erdogan just said where he wants to have the interest rates. But our model is more suitable for, let's say freer countries or not autocratic regimes. Okay, yeah, now 50 minutes left. Yeah, but let's talk about this also. Let's talk about the situation where we take these 10 years between financial crisis and Corona, this special situation. What would be the impact within our model when we assume really that we have this nominal zero lower bound? And this nominal zero lower bound, that we cannot go below zero with our nominal interest rate, this would then say that we have to change a little bit our general dependence of our Phillips curve. That our general positive dependence between interest rates and output is only given until we have a nominal interest rate of zero. And after that, it is just an horizontal line because we cannot go further. If I is zero, then this just means I cannot be minus 1%, that then real interest rate just matches negative inflation expectations. So then we have this kink within the Phillips curve. And now we have seen that we then can feed in the Phillips curve into the Taylor rule and that it still looks a little bit steeper, but everything else looks the same. And also this then means that the Taylor rule has now this horizontal part. And now we are going into our aggregate demand curve, that if we now calculate the cut between the Taylor rule and our IS curve at this point, these are all our general equilibria. But now this horizontal part is of course depending on the actual inflation. It will be expected inflation positively dependent on today's inflation, will mean the higher the inflation, the higher are the expected inflations. And if the cut at the low or at this inflation pi 1 here, this is, so to speak, the normal situation. We have a cut in the ascending part of the Taylor rule and in the decreasing part of the IS curve. So we obtain then a first equilibrium at this inflation rate and some corresponding output. If now the inflation goes down, and we come to this cut. We are at the end, so to speak, at the normal part. And this we have done in the introductory course. We obtain what we want, a negative slope of the aggregate demand curve. But if the inflation rate goes even down, and this means also, the economic performance is not that good because we have a correspondence between low inflation rates and low output, then we obtain this cut in the horizontal part of the third Taylor rule. And what now happens, it is quite astonishing. We obtain then these backbending aggregate demand curve. So the opposite direction, that on the even lower inflation rate, we obtain an even lower output. So this would be the normal AD curve. But if we approaching this nominal zero lower bound for the interest rates, the aggregate demand curve is bending back. And now we are going with this aggregated demand curve in our overall model using now the Phillips curve, which means we assuming we have this backbending aggregate demand curve and we have decreasing inflation expectations. And this also we had during this time. Remember I said the central banks really tried to push somehow the inflation rate away from zero. But within 2010 and 2020, we had only inflation rates of 0.5, maybe 1% or something like this. So there was really a fear of deflation expectations. And what does it mean if I have decreasing inflation expectations? I'm starting at y1. I have the decreasing output and maybe I obtain at first a slight positive impact, but then due to this backbending, oh, this has to be pi 3, sorry, that decreasing output means in the end I have decreasing inflation, not that much pressure from the demand side on the overall economy. But then I'm adapting my expectations and say, well, if the situation is bad, then of course, or not of course, but in general, the prices will not really rise in future. So in the second step, I have further decreasing inflation expectations. And this then forms a downward cycle that again, decreasing output, decreasing inflation expectations, and so on. And this, then maybe was really the approach the large central banks had within these 10 years, that they so aggressively pushed from the monetary policy side. Yeah, and the last things is then, what what would be better to model our economy. And of course, if we use these simple rules, so just the Taylor rule, then of course this is a quite easy approach. And also we can say with this, we can quite good predict monetary policy. And from this also the central banks adopted it somehow in order to stabilize expectations, also from the central bank point of view, good for stabilizing expectations in the market. And from this was also then did use the concept of forward guidance. This was really a time for some years where explicitly the Fed and the ECB announced we will do over the next 2 years the following things for the interest rates. But of course, Mr. Trump then really changed this approach of the Federal Reserve. But on the other hand, of course, if we just use this linear approach for monetary policy, since in the economy we think of that we are always doing some optimizing processes, maximizing our utility, maximizing profits, and so on, then of course we have to admit, maybe in very volatile times, it is okay to do it, but in general it will not be optimal. And therefore also, and about this we will talk later on, we find also so-called optimal rules where we always have to go through an optimizing process. But of course, this is quite often really complicated. And yeah, it is not that predictable. So somehow we have here something like a trade-off. Because if it's not predictable, then the expectations are not stable. And also we know if we have volatile expectations, then this is harmful for the economy in general. So what then would be really the best approach in general? This is a very hard question. And yeah, from a historical point of view, we can say that we started somehow from this approach that we mainly look on the monetary aggregates. Then it switched for practice that we said, okay, we look in general at the interest rate. And then we also said, well, it's a general policy instrument for the economy, for the society, very much is about the right communication of your policy. So the instrument is in general the communication, and then especially before Corona and before Mr. Trump, it was developed this concept of forward guidance, that this would be a quite good idea. This is also due to one very famous economist, which is called Michael Woodford. Maybe you hear sometimes of him. Well, he is professor at the MIT, and he wrote a really huge book, I think more than 1,000 pages, called Interested and Prices. Yeah, this only for or, uh, yeah, for the general overview in the end, but this you have mainly seen in the introductory course. In general, in the long run, we can say we still have to keep in mind the quantity theory of money, and especially if we look of implications in the long run, but we do not yeah, really see that we mainly could forecast the change of the monetary aggregates. And nowadays, what we also see behind this is that explicitly the velocity of money is only changing slightly. And due to digitalization and also due to now digital currencies, we have to take in question this assumption about a constant velocity of money. And because of this, also some central banks in the world really said, well, we do not look at money anymore because we cannot steer it. And here is one quote of the governor of the Bank of Canada. In Canada, we did not abandon money targets, they abandoned us. So we do not find it reliable in practice anymore. Or the Bank of England, they also skipped this monetary target in general. And yeah, they said whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby it's creating money. So they said it is the other way around. Remember in the introductory course, we said, well, I said credits. For this, I need central bank. So to speak, at first I have to look for central bank money, and then I can give out the new credit. And they said, well, in practice we find it the other way around. The private sector is just given the credit and then looks for the central bank money. So if it's the other thing around, they just create the money. We cannot steer it anymore. And also, what I've also found is some years ago, I think 2019 or something like this. I have to look it up. 2090, the Fed in the United States didn't skip the monetary aggregate, but they skip what we call M3. So our general approach, what we say, what we understand under money. They said we cannot really calculate M3, and therefore we don't do it anymore. And for the future, it will be very, very interesting what happens if we really get digital currencies. But I don't know in which direction we will go there. Okay, so then that's it for today, and see you next week.